The thing about ADHD is it's not a deficit or a disorder.
You're listening to When God Intervenes, the podcast where faith, hope, and healing come together for families with a loved one battling addiction. Welcome to another episode of When God Intervenes. So today I'm here with Dr. Fred Moss, and Dr. Fred Moss is a psychiatrist. Welcome, Dr. Fred. It's good to have you here today.
It's great to be here, Daryl. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for being here. And I know that our listeners are going to learn a lot from you. And why don't you just start by introducing yourself a little bit, tell our listeners a little bit about who you are, what your background is, and sort of how you operate, the
All
way
right.
you do things.
All right. That sounds great. Thank you for that. So, yeah, my name is Dr. Fred or Fred Moss, or some people call me Fred, and even a smaller group of people these days call me Dr. Moss. And, I am a doctor. I've been a psychiatrist for about 36 years, and I was in the mental health field for 9 years before that as a child care worker, even while I was going through medical school. So, on this January, coming up around the corner, it'll mark 45 years in the field. And, I grew up in Detroit, Michigan. I was born to be a healer. I had two brothers, 10 and 14 years older than me, there was a fair amount of chaos and disarray, as you can imagine, inside of my family. And I was the next child to be born. And my obligation, my job title was to bring joy, peace, and love to this chaotic situation in my house. My brothers have told me since that I did a pretty good job of that, at least for a couple of years. I don't think they'd say I did a good job of it for my whole life, but I'm sure they wouldn't. But for the first couple of years, I did bring joy and happiness. That's kind of a bundle of joy. And I really became very, very enchanted with the whole idea of communication as a young child. I remember literally being in my playpen and watching my brothers and my parents speak to each other and wishing and hoping that someday I would be able to do that too, because it was very clear that that's what people were into, is kind of communicating together and making things happen. I was very precocious as a child. I had these two brothers. They taught me all the things I needed to know. So, I knew about sex and drugs and rock and roll long before I even went into kind of kindergarten. And I'd been introduced to Procol Harum and Cream, those bands. And I was there. I came into kindergarten knowing things that none of my peers knew. So I was ahead of the class in a lot of ways, and, kind of got bored, I suppose, in early elementary years, and was certainly a talker. I was very, very interested in talking. And, the teachers they didn't know what to do with me, and no teacher in elementary school ever forgot having Fred as a student. That's for sure. Because, I was an A student. I was on the front of the class, and I was the class clown, and I was the one who talked all the time and made trouble. You probably remember the person in your class who fit that mold as well. That was me. And, I was really just looking to communicate. That's what I thought school was going to be for. And it isn't what school is for. Instead, I was muted and told to sit down and just do what the teacher says. And that got even worse and worse as the years went on. I was hoping, well, maybe where did these people learn how to communicate anyway? So, maybe junior high. And then it got kind of worse in junior high, then worse again in high school, where we really just sit down, be quiet, shut up, and, do what we say. And so, I was just exacerbated by the end of high school. And it was just like, well, what am I going to do? Like, because the university was only 40 miles away to the west, and they had great helmets. And I thought, well, I could go to the University of Michigan. So off to the University of Michigan I went, and hoping how to learn how to communicate. And I did indeed learn how to communicate in Ann Arbor, Michigan, but not at the University of Michigan. In the streets of Ann Arbor is where I learned how to communicate. And it was fun and everything, but school itself wasn't fun. And it was just like more of the same, this idea that they were teaching me things that were impertinent and irrelevant. And I just decided after a year and a half, I would drop out. And I dropped out, got on a Greyhound bus, came all the way to California through the south end, through the south route, through Phoenix and all, to Berkeley, California. And, to find out what my life was about. And I spent a month in Berkeley, and it was, I learned a lot, but it was unsustainable. My family told me to come back to school. They suggested I come back to school because my life wasn't sustainable the way it was laid out at that moment. And they told me there was this new industry that was happening that they thought I would be really great at. You might have heard of the industry. It's actually called computers. And the only computer that was available in the state of Michigan was actually at the University of Michigan. So back to the University of Michigan I went, and I spent day and night in the computer department, like with batch jobs and punch cards and the big computer, 2-acre facility called the computer. And that wasn't going to be my life either. I couldn't see being just a data player the rest of my life. So I dropped out one more time. And this time I pledged never to go back to university ever again. And my mom said, that's okay. You don't have to go back to school, but you do have to get a job. Yeah, moms will be that way. So she got me an application for a civil service job, a state of Michigan civil service job. And I had a choice between working in the unemployment office or working as a child care worker at Fairlawn Center in Pontiac, Michigan. And because the second job was actually coming up first, it was closer, and there was a 3-week orientation that I could get paid for full time. I decided to do that one. And I thought I would only stay for orientation. I really did. I thought I would stay for the 3 weeks, just diddle and dwiddle and hang in there and get 3 paychecks and buy myself a Volkswagen, drive around the country, and again, figure out what my life was about. But on the 4th week, my friend Paul convinced me to go up to the floors. He told me that if I quit, he'd have to quit or some sort of nonsense like that. And I was like, okay, I'll go up with you. And so we went up to Meadowview, and, there was the first time that I started getting paid to actually communicate. And all I was really doing was humanly connecting to these kids who were only like 6 or 7 years younger than me. And it was beautiful. I really got to be good at it fairly quickly, being able to feel for these children and be with them and hear them and listen to them and respect them and vice versa. And inside of that human connection, there was a robust and profound healing, a healing that I had never, ever experienced before, or, really, certainly way more profound than any medication or psychiatric treatment that I had ever heard of before or since, by the way. But I hated the way psychiatry was going. I hated the whole point of the psychiatrists who worked there. Jimmy and Johnny would get in a fight, or Tony would be up too late, and we'd call the doctor, and he would come down and interview Tony for like 4 seconds, and then interview us for like 7 seconds, and then go to the nursing station and write something in a chart. And we'd have to go retrieve the child and put him in the quiet room and hold him down, and then pull down the side of his sweatpants and pack him full of an injectable sedative made of antipsychotic sleep agents and stupor producing agents. And if the child was in a stupor for the next 24 hours, we'd call that a success story. And that's what we'd have to chart. That was so barbaric, hideous, and unacceptable that I knew I had to do something about it. So I decided that I would go back to school, and this time with the whole intention of finishing my undergraduate degree and going to be a psychiatrist and bringing communication into that field. So I truly went into psychiatry because I hated psychiatry. And that's really why I went in, no kidding. And, a few years later, after maintaining a job as a child care worker, both in Detroit and in Chicago, because I went to medical school at Northwestern University in downtown Chicago, I found myself as a child psychiatrist, trained as a child and adolescent psychiatrist. And off I came, and there was now the whole idea of psychiatry had now shifted, and there had been a significant paradigm shift, and psychiatry was now based on biological psychiatry or chemical imbalances, which were designed while I was in medical school, and I was most definitely not very aligned with that. So nevertheless, for the first half of my career, that's what I did, is I kind of found a way to be a diagnostician, learn everything I could about the psychiatric medicines. I got very good as a psychopharmacologist. And, I began to work everywhere because I was really just looking for a job that could support who I really was. So I would leave jobs when I learned that I couldn't do that which I knew was right. And I had many, many jobs in every single modality known to Western psychiatric medicine, for sure. And then I began to do something in 2006, which was to take some of my clients off of their medications. Finally began to just do that because, they weren't getting better, even if they thought that they might be better. And I began to do that on a regular basis to my lower risk, and then my medium risk, and even then my higher risk patients. And sure enough, each and every one of them almost reliably got better. but way better. So much so that their diagnosis disappeared because these drugs really don't work. That's what it turns out. They don't work to do what they are marketed to do. They do work to make people worse and create perpetual patients, but they don't work to do what they are marketed to do. So, and they give people a sense of improvement. So some people, and I want to make this disclaimer for your listeners, some people are really tied to their treatment and their drugs and their therapies and their doctors and their diagnosis. And that is fantastic. No problem. If that's you and you're listening, I'm not arguing with you. I'm not telling you you're wrong. You please got to keep doing what you're doing. Because if you've reached a point where you're at a point where you wouldn't change the way you're doing something, that's such a spectacular space to be in inside of this life that you absolutely can't change. If that's where you are, that's fantastic. Please keep doing that. Instead, what I'm aiming at is the tens or maybe hundreds of millions of people who don't feel like that, who feel like the system has failed them, has underdiagnosed, overdiagnosed, undertreated, overtreated, mistreated them over time. And this is who this conversation is really aimed at. Now, around that time, I also began to work with addicts. So I know that we've talked a little bit about that. I began to work in the Suboxone clinics. I was a treatment advocate for Reckitt Benckiser, which is the maker of Suboxone. And I also worked with alcoholics all over the Cincinnati area. Found myself really being very effective with that group as well. And leaning on God and like you also said. So leaning on the whole merits maybe of the 12-step program, where God is sort of referred to, although, they would say that, it's God as you understand him. And that's still God, of course. And, so I knew a lot about the AA program and the 12-step program and supported that. And I was the doctor that worked alongside of many people who were involved with seeking out God as an opportunity to work with their own addictions one way or another and find a way to sobriety and a grounded lifestyle. The next several years, I was a traveling doctor. I was all over this country and I had licenses in multiple states, and it's called a locum tenens. I would fill in with doctors who were missing for whatever reason for a limited period of time, a few months or so, and then move on to the next job. And so I got to see how psychiatry and addiction services were handled around the country. It's very similar in each and every state, just to be honest. And after that, began to actually take my act around the world. So now I took Dr. Fred out there into other countries, including Bhutan and Nepal and Thailand and Israel, Italy, France, and England, where I did telepsychiatry. And I was a proponent, or I would say an ambassador for telepsychiatry as early as 2013, long before it had become the gold standard. I really saw the future as being that psychiatry and computers were going to get along very well. And of course, they now have with telehealth and telepsych. I became, really asking myself, what do people want from doctors? Why do they even come to a clinician in the first place? What are people, you got a problem. Why are you going to come to me? What do I have for you? Other than the idea that I can give you a diagnosis and relinquish your responsibility for your life and give you some sort of alphabet soup that you can hang on yourself, and then give you some medication that's supposed to be geared towards helping you, but actually makes you worse into a perpetual patient. What else could I really do? What were people really, really looking for? Now, you might be able to guess what I came up with, and that is that people everywhere, whether I was in Bhutan or St. Louis, what they really wanted was a human connection. That's what every one of us is. That's why we're having this podcast. That's why you invited me on, so that me and you could possibly connect, and maybe I could assist you, or you could assist me in connecting with your listeners, or we together could connect. Human connection is at the heart of all healing. I'm quite certain of that. And what I did after that, when I came back to the States, was started to be a writer. I wrote a couple books and I took a few stages, and I began to be an actual coach. Called the Undoctor, undiagnosing, unmedicating, and undoctrinating people. And I really began to take this, to be honest with myself, to clear the duplicity that I had lived throughout my career, because I really was not that interested in diagnosing people or in medicating people. Yet I've had over 30,000 patients and over 100,000 prescriptions in my history. So it's not like I haven't done it, but I've not been aligned with it, because I took an oath that said first do no harm. And I'm not sure that either of those things don't do harm. So I began to see that the only way we can really get access to this was by getting people to realize that maybe there's nothing wrong with them in the first place. Like, that's what's really here. So we come to doctors not to find out if there's something wrong with us, but to find out what's wrong with us. Because we already know there's something wrong with us when we show up at a psychiatric office. That's why we go there. We want just confirmation and then some label that we can pin it on, like, oh, I must be bipolar, or I must have ADHD, or I must have depression, or I must have schizoaffective disorder, I must have narcissistic personality disorder, or maybe I'm on the autistic spectrum, or maybe I'm an addict, or maybe I'm have social anxiety, or whatever I think I have. And once we have that, we get to say stuff like, that wasn't me, that was my disorder. And it isn't true for everybody. Back to the same disclaimer, please respect that. And I really mean that for your listeners, but it's true for so many. And so who I've now become is somebody who's really just interested in authenticity and communication, connection, and creativity as a source of all healing. Because what we have to do if we're going to heal is actually be able to listen to people and speak to people openly and honestly. We have to be in touch with our own genuine self so that we can create a genuine connection with another. The frequency and the harmonic frequency that's rightfully available when we do that is one that can connect humans as a web, like actually get people to see and be with people honestly. I don't have to stutter anymore. I don't have to stop and think when I say what I say, when I'm being genuine and authentic and pure and honest with myself. And that's what I invite people to do, is take steps towards their own genuineness, because over time, what we've learned how to do is pretend to be someone that we're not in order to protect the person that we are. Now, we've all learned how to do that. Where do we learn? Right there in the conventional educational system. Right? When they told us that, no, Fred, we don't want you to talk about, cream and Procol Harum in first grade. We want you to sit down and, do some cursive. And it was like, okay, I understand. I don't really understand, but I agree, or I comply, or something like that. And that's what we all had to do. We had to become somebody we weren't in order to protect the person that we were. And we never went back to, to clear up this crack in the cement. So many of us are duplicitous each and every day and living with the pain of being duplicitous. I help people get back to their own authenticity. And again, drugs cannot be very helpful, whether they're street drugs or they're drugs made by the pharmacology industry. Neither of them are really very helpful in finding our genuine self. Now, some people have an exception to that, seeing that, maybe when they get high or they take psychedelics, they find a greater sense of themselves. That's true. But it is very true, and I'm not misaligned with that. I find there's very real power in some of the new treatment possibilities that are out there, as long as they don't get into the hands of the pharmacological industry. As long as they're purely from the ground, for instance, we can make some real headway. But if they're going to be destroyed and destructed by the pharmacological industry and put into pills or capsules, I suspect that there's going to be similar trouble, because these medicines are not built to make us better. They're built to create perpetual patience and cause the symptoms that they're marketed to treat. So when people finally learn that, they get to hear and be with that fact. Now, all of a sudden, we get to learn that the only way to avoid those medicines is to realize that maybe you didn't need them in the first place, because maybe there was nothing wrong with you. And maybe you really are one of God's children, whole, complete, and perfect, just like you are, dealing with all the pain, all the suffering, all the misery, all the distraught, all the despair, everything that you have in being human. Each and every day, each of us goes through a fair amount of suffering and misery. And that's completely okay. That's what is called to be human. That's the human condition. If we go back to the literature, going all the way back to forgiveness, but all the way to the Bible and even everything since then, you'll see that there's pain and suffering in being human, all the way back to Eden, all the way back to Genesis 1, all the way back to everything. There's been pain and suffering. There's never been anybody who's written an honest book about there not being pain and suffering in their life. Like, never. Not Buddha, not Jesus, not the Torah, not the Quran, not the I Ching, not Sartre, not Descartes, not Shakespeare, not Plato, not Socrates. No. All of them have had very troubling times that they were dealing with. And it's hard to be a human. Or it should say, being a human is hard. And it's not only hard, but it's difficult. There's challenges, obstacles, and hurdles that we have to deal with every day. And when we acknowledge that, we can see that the baseline truth is that as we are humans, we have an opportunity really to see that leaning on our higher power allows us to, give up the parts of us that we don't have control of and give that to a higher power. Like things happen so miraculously. I don't know about you, but my afternoon from this last podcast I was on 2 hours ago and then a phone call I received from the exact person literally that I was thinking about on that very second, and now into you, and having both of these calls be similar enough, it's like, oh yeah, that is so, that the chance of all that happening like randomly is zero, like straight zero. And if we think
Mm.
about it, every day things happen for which the chances of them happening randomly is straight zero. Not that
Yeah.
that proves the existence of God, but I know that when I give up, when I, let go and let God, if you will, I get a life that actually works, that I don't have to carry around this false responsibility for being in control of. That's where I am
Yeah.
today. Yeah.
Wow, that was great.
Thank you.
Um, so yeah, it's interesting how we're different in that, I was always really quiet, shy, easygoing growing up, but I'm more of a listener. I like to listen to people, and I do think communications are extremely important, and that's one of the number one things that I work with parents on is communicating with their child, battling addiction. You mentioned ADHD, and we talked about my son a little bit, Chase, before we started this interview, and he was diagnosed ADHD early on, and his kindergarten teacher was pushing us to do something about it, and we pushed back a little while, and we finally caved in, and he started on a low dose of Concerta. I always kept it as low as I could, as low as I felt like I could. But, one of the questions that I frequently ask parents almost every time when I talk to a parent that comes to me for the first time is, has your child ever been diagnosed ADHD? Have they ever been on any kind of ADHD medications? And the answer, especially when it comes to boys, is like probably, I've never, kept track of all the numbers, but it's probably 95% of the
Wow.
time,
Mhm.
especially with boys. And it's a very high number with girls also. So there's definitely a correlation between substance use and the ADHD diagnosis. And I don't know, do you have any? I think I can kind of guess where you would go with that, but what feedback do you have for me on
Yeah,
that?
I think that the thing about ADHD is it's not a deficit or a disorder. And the two D's are that. The two D's are
That's
deficit
right.
and disorder.
Yeah.
And the fact that I don't want to sit still to look at a chalkboard full of boring crap doesn't
Right.
make me sick. I'm
That's
not
right.
sick just because I won't sit still and look at a chalkboard and listen to somebody who's giving me nonsense that's unusable, and while showing me a whiteboard that has stuff on it that I will never need, that is completely boring and irrelevant. The fact that I can't sit still and not play around when that's happening doesn't make me sick. After all, we don't blame a log for burning in a fire. And this is true in all of psychiatry. Like, this is a very obstacle ridden, challenging, hurdle ridden world that we're living in, right? It's
Mhm.
very, very difficult to put our act together. None of us know what the hell we're doing. None of us, not you, not me, no one. I'm 66, you're 63. We don't know what we're doing either. Let's face it, we don't. We just like get up in a day, and I don't know, we get up because we get up, and then we take on what we take on. We have some responsibilities and accountabilities, and sometimes we carry those out too. And that's what we do. And we act like if we're pushing back on the system, if we don't know how to stay intact with the system, that means that there's something wrong with us. There is nothing wrong with us at that point. So I don't really support frequently the diagnosis of ADHD, because it absolutely implies and even states out loud that there's a deficit. No, there isn't. And that there's a disorder. No, there isn't. There's an attention issue. It's true. I don't want to pay attention to you if you're going to serve me up crap that's entirely boring.
Yep.
Straight up.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
have ADHD. You have served me something that doesn't capture my attention. That's all that
Right.
happened. And
I will. I'm
Yeah,
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I agree with you 100% on that. And I'll never forget, going to, we went to have a meeting with my son's teacher in the second grade, and she was explaining to us how she had just spent 20 minutes lecturing her students on mat borders, and he came up to her and asked her what a mat border was. And I'm thinking, what can you say about mat borders for 20 minutes? He
exactly.
tuned you out a long time ago.
Exactly, exactly. And it sounds like your son, may he rest in peace, of course, and really had, really, was just curious, like just wanted to know, like,
Right,
if you're curious, teachers can get offended. If you're actually curious, like, what the hell, what was
right.
that? What was it? What did you just say? Like, if you, that, that's a very legitimate question in most of our
Mhm.
schooling. Like, what are
Yeah,
you trying to get? What are you trying to get over here? Because it's not
yeah,
working, you know. I'm not getting it. And that's why I'm getting B's or C's, or that's why you think I need ADHD because I'm going to get up and throw a paper airplane, or I'm going to, pull the hair of the girl next to me, or whatever I'm doing. Um, it's not my fault for not getting in touch with things that are untouchable after all. So that's why the gross nature of um, ADHD diagnoses get made, because the schools deliver your son, your daughter, they need help. You need to bring them, you bring them to therapy. And then what happens with these medicines is that, at least for a moment, these medicines give a sense to the client or to the recipient of being calm and steady and focused and all that, just like caffeine does. But then they create a major problem in that they often they're actually designed to make the symptoms worse. So slowly but surely, the symptoms get worse, and then we increase or we add or we change the medicines to deal with that. Maybe we add a medicine for a particular so-called side effect, or maybe we just increase the dose, or maybe we change into a different one from Concerta to Adderall to Strattera, whatever we're going to do. And um, you ask about the impact on the the addicted population, like the people out there who are abusing drugs. Look,
hmm
if you look at the medications, especially the stimulants, which are given so freely to people, even these days, I've even seen 3-year-olds who are being given um, stimulant because they're not following their parents or something. They're like not following directions, or they're like running around, like, you're going to give a 3-year-old some medicine because they're running around. Last I looked, is that's what a 3-year-old is supposed to do. And but we give them medicine so that we can calm them down. And usually they're really just responding to some environmental stressor. But instead of like recognizing this idea that we don't blame a log for burning in a fire, that maybe this child is living in his own little fire, we try to medicate them and make the fire. We make the log so inflammable, right? Like we actually like cover the log, being the person, with an inflammable substance so that the flame doesn't burn them. Now, does this create addiction? I think it creates substance abuse at some level, because these stimulants create a different realm of being, a different way of looking at life inside of these children. And then, the whole idea of, the stimulants have um, terrific street value. Each and every
hmm
pill is, $10, $20 on the street market, and that's because it causes a form of euphoria. And so that's what's happening, is that these are very enjoyable drugs in their own right, and along with helping us focus briefly and then worsening the symptoms to the point that we can't ever find the proper dose in many cases. um, leads to the playground, or the playing ground, the playing field, to begin using substances on the outside. Why not? Why not, after all? I mean, I'm not good without drugs, apparently. The society has told me that. So I might as well use drugs and find some degree of euphoria that way.
Right, right. Um, uh, yeah, I mean, we're on the same wavelength with all of that. I want to make sure we cover a couple of these things while
Yeah.
we still have time. I want to talk really to the parents out there who have a child that's battling addiction. Um, First of all, the problem, one of the issues that the parents have is they have trouble managing their emotions. So it comes down to fear of what's going to happen to my child. If I don't do this or I don't do that. And so then they get over into, especially when it's an adult child, they get over into trying to micromanage their child's life so that they can prevent them from making mistakes that could be fatal. Um, and there's a breakdown in communication that happens along the way there. No one like this, an adult, even young adults, especially don't like to be talked to or treated like they're a child, even by their own parents. Um, what kind of advice do you have for parents who find themselves in this situation with a
Yeah.
child that's addicted to drugs or alcohol?
Wow. Well, I think that the only advice that comes to mind, it kind of boils to the top here. I appreciate the power of the question as well, the context of the question that you're asking is, everybody wants to be heard and seen for who they are and who they're not. And there's nothing, if we can treat people, if we can get and look directly at people and really get that who they are is who they are and who they're not is who they're not, and see them and hear them for that, then a great amount of respect can be served. And the other thing I often tell parents is you don't want to leave your post as a parent. There's police already out there. There's teachers already out there. There's advocates already out there. And when you become one of those things, instead of being a parent, you have to realize that you just left the post and no one will ever replace you. So it's very important to keep your parental roles and your parental intentions as parents. So you don't want to skip out and become a probation officer or become a police person, with your son or your daughter. Now, the experience that a parent is usually having with respect to their child abusing drugs, against their wishes, against the parents' wishes, is often, if they really look at it, it's like really, it's a reflection of who they are as parents. Like they're worried that, I didn't raise my child to be an addict. I didn't raise my child to be taking fentanyl or to be taking, methamphetamine or marijuana or whatever your drug of choice is. That isn't how I raise my child. So this looks bad on me, and that's the hurry or the urgency, is that it looks bad on the parent. But so I think what I really would say, and this is like a lofty invitation, is continue to love the daylights out of your son or daughter and not, trying to help them as if help means come off drugs doesn't always work that way. What they really want to be doing more than anything is communicating effectively with the people around them and getting the support that they need, no matter what they're doing with their life. Like be right there. Like if your son is smoking too much weed, or you have a daughter who's into, smoking meth, or you have somebody else who's, maybe even shooting heroin or fentanyl. Although, again, this is a very, very tall order, and I respect that immensely. What they want more than anything is to be heard and supported by their parents as parents. And it's very difficult because, sometimes there's violence, or there's threats, or there's stealing, or lying, or cheating of some sort. And parents want to do something about it because the last thing they want is to lose their children to jail, or even worse, to some form of accident or death, as you well know. And there's an opportunity to just step in as parents and really get your child for who they are and who they're not, and don't leave your post as a parent.
Wow. Yeah, that's a great answer. Great answer. Yeah, the communication, it becomes, I call it the fog of battle, that parents find themselves in this situation a lot of times, and they can't think clearly because of all of the emotions that come up because they're so scared of what's going to happen to their child,
Exactly. Exactly.
so they don't communicate as well, and it helps to have that outside party who's not as emotionally attached and
It
can,
does.
can observe from the outside. So I've got one more question for you. What I hear a lot from talking to the parents who have children in these circumstances, not always, but quite often, is that their child has experienced some kind of trauma, if you will. Could be, somebody in the family, there's been some type of uh, like a rape or some other type of inappropriate sexual activity, or maybe they've witnessed a suicide or something along those lines. So they're dealing with all of this turmoil inside over how all of this makes them feel. And I feel like that in some cases, the street drugs are a way for them to they're looking for a coping mechanism to deal with all of this internal chaos, if you will. Does that add up to you coming from as a psychiatrist? Does that?
Well, I know that's the conventional way of looking at things, this idea of self-medicating. The idea that is self-medicate in order to deal with it, as if it serves that purpose. Now, the truth is, it doesn't serve that purpose. It makes things worse. So that might be why we lean into drugs for the first place, but it doesn't serve the purpose. And if that was the reason, the drug itself would have to serve that purpose. See, I think that once you get involved with drugs, it creates a different realm, but it doesn't release you from the pain of whatever your suffering is. It actually tends to amplify it more often than not. When you drink or you smoke or you eat or you inject or whatever you do, your pain, the pain and suffering that you're hoping will be squelched or blanketed or smothered, really doesn't work with the use of drugs. So although that is the conventional reality that is spoken of by the public, I'm not positive that fits exactly. I think that's why someone maybe start using, like, I don't give a hoot anymore, I think I'll smoke some crack. But that doesn't, smoking crack doesn't make you not give a hoot anymore. And that's the problem. So I don't really appreciate that it doesn't serve that purpose ultimately, even if it did serve the purpose of the initial intention.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. That maybe that's why people start, but it doesn't. It ultimately it makes the situation worse going down the road. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, well, it's been great talking with you today. I've really enjoyed this. I appreciate it. And we'll have to get back together sometime, Dr. Moss, and talk a little bit more.
I would love that. And so I just want to ask you about your cap. I noticed U.S. Navy Blue Angels. Are you actually a pilot?
I am a former pilot, yes. So I have never flown in the Navy. I went to an air show with my youngest son a couple of summers ago and bought this, and we enjoyed watching the Blue Angels perform there at that air show. But I'm an Army aviator. I flew helicopters in the military, in the Army National Guard, and also flew civilian as a commuter airline pilot, and before that, corporate. But anyway, thank you. I appreciate you asking about that.
Of course.
I haven't flown in years, though. It's been a really long time since I've been in the cockpit.
My dad and I used to fly. My dad was the flyer. I was his so-called co-pilot when I was a teenager. He had, he flew Cessnas and Pipers. So I was back there in the Detroit City Airport. It's 172s, 182s, 172s, and that was
Yeah, I've got a little time in those. Yeah, I trained in the 172 quite a bit.
So, 150 is a little baby one too. Yeah, very good. Well, thank you so much, Daryl. It's been a deep pleasure. Really appreciate you.
Thank you, Dr. Moss. Thank you for tuning in to When God Intervenes. If you found today's episode helpful, please subscribe and leave a review. Your feedback helps us reach more families in need of hope and healing. For more resources and support, visit our website at thefamilyrecoverycoach.com. Until next time, stay strong and keep the faith.